Hello and welcome back to another episode of Lessons in Product Management. I'm your host, John Fontenot, and today we get to hear from Tony Poon, the Chief Product Officer at R0. And Tony has some really interesting viewpoints and perspectives on the topic of ego. And it's talked about a lot about how we need humility and empathy as product people. But I'm really excited for you to hear what Tony has to say about the topic of ego today. And I think it intersects really nicely with what I wrote in chapter 1 of my book, Never Assume, about never assume you're correct, right? And so if you haven't gotten the book yet, go check it out. Never Assume, the 10 Fatal Assumptions Great Product Managers Never Make. It's on Amazon. But enough of me. Let's get into what Tony has to say. Let's get into the show. Hey, Tony, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, John. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. Glad you're here. So today we're going to talk about ego, but before we dive in, I'd love to have you introduce yourself for the listeners and give them a little background on yourself and what you're doing today.
Sure. I'm Tony Poon. I'm Chief Product Officer at R0, a company that's focusing on helping to make indoors safe. Certainly a pertinent topic nowadays, important mission. My background, I can't say that I intentionally to become a product manager. Definitely fell into it and realized that I am a product manager. But my background started in semiconductor, very typical engineer in the dungeons without a window. Really on silicon devices, focusing a lot on now looking backwards, kind of first generation movement of bits. About 20 years ago now, I'm dating myself. From the big transition between analog to digital. So lots of generation 1 of buses. So wired and wireless, flash media card, Bluetooth Gen 1, PCI Express Gen 1 for servers, things like that. And I started asking as an engineer the annoying question of why am I doing this? That when you ask those questions in the dungeon world, they usually boot you out. So I inevitably migrated towards being a system architect. In this case, moving from Texas to California here now, haven't left since. Focusing on video communication. So I was doing webcam system architecture. Fell in love with it. Loved the idea of connecting people with video and voice. And it was the first time I actually understood what it meant to trade off between customer and engineering and time. Oh, that was a big awakening. And then fell in love with it. I did that for a few years and then realized I didn't know enough about video. So I actually went back into silicon, learned more about video, really how to make video, what are the physics behind it. That was the first time I became a product manager. And then eventually I realized, well, okay, knowing video is not enough. I need to be able to do something with it. So I went to the graphics. So I went to AMD, did a lot of AMD plus Apple things. And then eventually I migrated my way into startups. I was doing product for a startup called Lytro. It was really consumer cameras, and eventually we turned into videography and photography for enterprises. Eventually became a Google company. And then I've done drones after that. So I'm a total nerd who can say no to flying robots and camera. So I just okay, sign me up. And then I realized it was a big mission, when I heard about R0, and then here I am.
Awesome. Sounds like quite the journey and getting to touch on a lot of really cool technology throughout.
Yeah, I'm one of those that run towards training. I'm kidding. But I tend to like really complex problems and like working with really smart people and kind of getting out of the way and solving them. So and particularly because of my system background, the intersection between hardware and software and making experiences work.
That's really cool. Yeah. Early in my product career, I got to work on kind of a cross between like a hardware software type of experience. So I can totally relate.
Yeah, it's a little
totally
schizophrenic because of the development unit economics as well as development cycles and certainly lots of context switching.
Totally. There's no shortage of that in product, right?
Yeah, amen.
So I heard some underpinnings of the topic that we're going to talk about today, kind of as you were explaining your introduction, where the engineers in the dungeon don't ask why, and it sounds like there could be some ego behind why people kind of treated you that way.
It was probably because I didn't know enough. I would chalk it up to that. Yeah. I mean, when it comes to ego for product, we're like, I learned that the hard way, which is I bear lots of scars that I could share over drinks. On like the theme that I have become like really aware of to remind myself all the time is the difference between passion and conviction. And it's really underpinned by ego on, well, sometimes people think ego is a bad thing. It really isn't. It just depends on how it gets applied and how it seeps in, whether or not you're aware of it. And, a lot of it is rooted in like conscious or unconscious biases. And then from a product perspective, the differentiation, at least the way I think about it is, when it's pure ego or pure biases, is really passion driven. Our job is start from passion and turn it into conviction through learnings and data. And then it's like our goal and our accountability to every time build product based on conviction.
So I've heard expressions like be stingy on vision, but be flexible on the details. Is that kind of what you're getting at, where like the vision is kind of where the passion lies, but the details is where like maybe the bad ego seeps in, or how do you view that?
I think it comes in kind of every phase of the product development. Certainly when you're nothing but an idea, like it starts from passion. That's why I think it isn't a bad thing. It actually is the most inspirational part of any product development, but is really the process of starting with a dream, getting to a place where you actually have a goal, and then underpinning that with as much removal of biases with data as possible, so that you actually have a plan that you have conviction around, because you now understand it beyond yourself. So I think it's more of a phase than it is like ego's always bad, but it's when ego it should be taken over by more data and conviction, is that conscious process and the milestones as well as ceremonies that you have to go through to remind yourself that you have done that is really important.
Gotcha. So to double click on that a little bit more, are there clear like milestones or indicators where, I guess, personal red flags as we're trying to be introspective of like, when is my bad ego getting in the way versus when is this okay? Like, do you have some good heuristics around that?
Yeah, and this is like, certainly did not invent these, but I find them extremely useful. But if you start asking explicitly, even for products specifically, the 3 whys, like 5 whys also get a little bit too far depending on which phases you're in the ideation and concepting. But it's really the who and the why, starting with those 2 first. And then if you can get to a place where you feel like, yeah, there's some objectivity here, and then you start asking the what. A lot of folks, kind of skip the stuff in between and say like, here's a great concept, here's where we want to get to. And you just kind of mush everything in between and start executing. Pausing a little bit and being able to write down, and most importantly, explain it to other people. The who and the why, I find to be a just fantastic litmus test. One, you're opening up yourself for the possibility of being wrong. And the other is you're actually listening to perspectives that help you enhance your understanding of what your problem was.
Gotcha. Does that kind of go back to kind of the whole empathy notion in product management, where if we're truly listening and we're truly trying to empathize with the who and the why, then that in theory that should reduce the bad ego of like, no, I'm going to start with this assumption and it's got to be that assumption all the way through.
Yeah, I think there's some magic in forcing yourself to kind of put pen to paper, because once you write down full sentences have structure that require you have certain elements. You have the character, you have the plot, you have the climax. All of those things are actually part of the product narrative. And once you write it down and start explaining to other people, you inevitably start to have to force yourself to be that character in that story and describe why is it helping you, or what is it doing for you, or how you're going to use it. So like the act, it's fairly simple, but the process of being able to write it down, talk through it, actually vets a lot of things. And most importantly, forces you to think through, because you now have to be prepared to answer to yourself and other people.
Yeah, that makes sense. So as
Yeah.
you're writing these things down and you're going and you're socializing these things, um, like what are some of the, I guess, the ways, like kind of going to down to like the tactical level, like what are some of the ways we should be trying to kind of invalidate our assumptions about what we believe to be reality?
Yeah, I think let's start with some of the symptoms first.
Okay.
I think some of the symptoms are really interesting. I'm still a student of like what may look like that what could be ego. I think I typically I see like four main things. I would just simplify it by, at least the way I think about it, is like I'm smarter, I'm right, uh, things will work out, or I feel safer if I did this or didn't do this. Those are like kind of the four main categories that I kind of see different product managers in different cycles of different type of products. And then recognizing them actually helps you ask different questions and understanding, like, have you, like, if the symptom is I'm smarter, then like you really have to push on, like, have you written down the personas? Do you know what their workflows really are? And have you understood the problem clearly? Because the I am smarter symptom is typically getting to conclusion of what the root problem is too soon. And then what happens is you inevitably build a solution that may not necessarily solve the customer's problem. The I am right one is super interesting, which is you're solutioning a either workflow or a vision to which a customer actually don't care for. So that's actually probably the most dangerous. The things will work out one, this I actually appreciate a lot. It's actually not like a direct form of ego in my opinion, but it's like the forever optimist. Like not understanding or spending enough time thinking about the possibilities of, more importantly, like what have we not thought through? What are the critical decisions and what are the huge risks that we want to start hypothesizing and validating? And then the feel safe one is actually really interesting, which is not challenging yourself enough because you're afraid your ego is going to be hurt. It's actually a bit of a complex one, because you're afraid to be wrong, so you want to protect your ego, so you try to go the safe path, not realizing that your solutioning could take a little bit more risk but have a much higher reward. So like stuff like that, you start asking, well, have you thought about the other things? Have you thought about doing more and understanding what the risk actually is in regards to how much more you might be able to do for the users? So many of these, either in the early concepting, but like a little bit after is when you start writing down your hypotheses. And I think those type of questioning are perfectly suited for that phase. Because once you get like a little bit too far, now you're starting to rip stuff out, and the damage gets a little bit deeper if you do it a little too late.
Gotcha. So as I hear you talk about some of these things, right? Like I could see it being applied in different scenarios, right? Whether you're at an early stage startup where you're the whole thing is pretty much a concept, or it could be a PM working at the feature level. And both scenarios carry different levels of risk. Maybe at a large enough company, the feature level has a similar financial risk of a seed stage startup. But like, do you see the processes or kind of those four key ego areas differing at all, or do you feel like they transfer pretty well regardless of which situation you're in?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would caveat, maybe add a dimension to that, if I may. There are startups that do something a little better in an existing market. And then there are startups that try to disrupt or create a new market. And to me, the biggest differences are whether or not you have data to go mine to inform your product. And I have found myself in many cases the latter category, which is like, category creation, and therefore like a lot of this. So in those cases, you kind of have to recognize what can be had, and then filling that with a little bit more ego driven, but with logic, hopefully, and do as much validation as you feasibly can but understanding that there just isn't enough information for you to balance out to change from passion to conviction. So I think you're bringing up a really good point. Depending on the type of company and the type of mission that you're on, sometimes there's limited data that you can go get because of lack thereof, or the amount of velocity that you're trying to push in terms of getting to market, that you kind of have to make a call of, here's how much ego that I'm going to have, because I need to either make the dates or there just simply won't be enough customer to tell me. And then this is the amount of conviction we can build. But I think one could still write those down and say, like, look, these are the things that we're not going to be able to get to. Here's a reason why. Are these reversible decisions or not? And if not, here's how we de-risk it, and go. Yeah. I think it's a really, really good question. And then for startups that are building something better, I think that becomes a little richer on, like, there's existing things you want to improve upon, therefore data could flow a lot better. So that's where hopefully you can find the time and the audience to go inform you to build better conviction versus like riding purely on passion.
Yeah, that makes sense. So there's a lot of talk about like the art versus the science of product, right? And to your point about, like, in some situations, like, there's diminishing returns on validation because there's only so much data you can go get to translate passion into conviction. So is that kind of where the art kicks in of kind of understanding where that threshold is of, okay, I've reached enough, or I've gotten enough data, synthesized enough data to where we can, with some conviction, like, make a decision? Or do you still think that there's like a science around that too?
Hard to unpack, because hard to unpack that one, mostly because, like, look, I think all of us are learning what the right ways are, and to the best of my ability, my answer so far is there is no right way. But I think there are practices that genuinely help in most cases, and that might be what people refer to as science. They're just like, these are things that you typically do that will, for most cases, help. Like, if we call it that science, great. Call it practice, great. But I think from a product management's perspective, you cannot do it without intuition. Like, it's just part of the game. And some of it, the intuition is built by experience. Some of the intuition is built by your awareness of your customer and the market. So I think there's going to be forever a balance of what risk do we choose to take, and what do we believe we know and have validated enough to have, enough conviction to go. I think ultimately, arts and science or not, I think it comes down to what decisions you are making together with the team, and what risk level have you aligned to accept, and what are we going to do about it if it doesn't pan out. So I think it comes down to hypotheses proving and scoping. How are we going to attack, like, this release versus next release, this product versus the next product. I don't know if I answer your question, because the art and science one, to me, it's a little bit nebulous always, and I continue to think that, well, why can't it be both? Because I have only seen both.
No, I think it's true, and I think, like, the whole the common adage you get in products, like, it depends. Like, it typically, like, it being both is also pretty true in most cases of like, there's a combined intuition or art, and then there's like practices or science that are pretty well understood and well vetted in certain applications and situations. So I would agree that, in my opinion, it seems to be both.
Yeah, and I think, like, sometimes, like, we talked a little bit about ego, like at least the types of egos that I think there are. I'm sure there are many others, and I'm sure I exhibit many of them almost every day, and try to control it. And I think sometimes also, like, when you get helicopter into a company, or when you join a new team, there's also like things that you start to see that you might be able to attribute to, like, hey, maybe there isn't enough conviction from the beginning. Sometimes when you see like heroics in a program where, like, somebody just carries the whole thing, a lot of times is because they were starting the program with I'm smarter or I'm right, and then now they end up having to carry the whole thing because there's a lot of gaps now that you need to be filling at the same time. And sometimes, like, when you see teams taking extremely high risk and then building products that are not scalable, and sometimes it's part of what they realized was, overconfident and I'm right. And now they've kind of pigeonholed themselves into a very specific solution that may not be scalable to more customers. And I think sometimes when you see underachieve outcomes, so to speak, we all suffer from that, and that many reasons for that. But I think from a observe ego perspective, I think a lot of times when you see the forever optimist, like things will work out, is when you see like maybe you're not meeting all of your outcomes and you're not meeting some of your success criteria. It's good. Well, some of it was, I hope things work out, and you didn't have a right plan and enough conviction to go say that, yes, this will work out, at least to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of analogies I can draw there.
Sounds like you have some scars.
Well, I think in other contexts where this applies, right? Where like, the whole belief of things will work out, right? Like I always say that untested beliefs aren't very strong beliefs. And so like translating that into a product context is, if you believe something to be true, like there's clear value in like pressure testing it to see, and like trying to put some level of validation around it or try to invalidate it. To your point earlier, de-risking the potential negative outcomes, right? Where if this isn't the right way, or customers don't actually want it, or it doesn't actually solve their problem, or we didn't understand their problem to begin with, understanding that's going to save you a lot of time and money and wasted effort. So I definitely agree that like, it sounds like the culmination of this conversation is really that of like checking your ego at the door enough to say that like, I need to de-risk this enough to feel confident that we're gonna be closer to achieving our outcomes, and we're not moving in the wrong direction.
And my own self-reflection, a lot of times when I'm like maybe recommending some directions or helping product managers think through how we should decide certain things, I would actually inspect myself as I'm thinking about the problem in my head. Do I use a lot of I, or do I actually use a lot of customers' names? There's actually a really simple test if you even ask yourself, as you think about this problem, when you're describing, is there a lot of I's in there? If so, like, okay, red flag, something's wrong here. Maybe there isn't enough understanding of the personas themselves for you to like easily transport yourself into being that person. I actually caught myself more than once. I'm like, oh, wait, I believe that. I actually have no idea if the customer know that, or if the customer actually need that. So like, there are like small things that I think each of us like personally develop as really quick litmus test on, have we gone too far in terms of passion, or do we need to come back and build a little bit more data in terms of conviction? And I think full disclosure is, depending on the risk tolerance of the company and the team, there's no right or wrong answer, but like, you just have to do it consciously. And especially when it comes to like hardware or intersection between hardware and software, where the stakes are a little higher. That's when passion versus conviction become even more critical for you to enumerate to the team and align, like, look, these are the things that we have conviction around. These are the things that we feel strongly about. We won't use the word passion, but we need to learn along the way. And here's how we're going to learn along the way.
No, I love that. And Tony, I've loved this conversation. It's been very enlightening and a good reminder as I go about my own day of checking myself as as I have these conversations. So thanks for joining, Tony. If the listener wants to be able to find out more about you or R0, how do they go about doing that?
Certainly come to r0.com, reach out directly to me. I'm a nerd around product, hardware. I'm probably a bigger nerd than I like to admit. Anything around that, just reach out LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, I'll link that in the show notes, and please go connect with Tony. And Tony, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, make sure you like and subscribe if you're watching on the YouTube channel. If you're watching if you're listening on the podcast, make sure that you rate and review and subscribe or follow if you haven't already. And thanks for joining me this week, and we'll see you next week for another lesson in product management.